Welcome back to LBMC's Cybersecurity Sense. This is William Parks, your host, with Kyle Hinterberg and Andy Kerr. And we are back again with another update, another monthly update. And this time we're going to be covering Requirement 8 with our typical news coverage as well. So, gentlemen, how are y'all doing? Welcome back to another episode.
Doing pretty good.
Good.
Recovered from Thanksgiving.
Yeah. I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving out there. I know it was full of a lot of food and family time. So I don't know about you guys. You guys have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah, I made it out alive, so I can't.
Can't complain there. You made it. That's all that matters.
That's right.
So in good old fashion, we'll kick off the news. Kyle, if you want to lead us there.
Sure. One of the things that's not really new news, but it's kind of nice is, obviously, as we've been talking about PCI 4.0, and if people have been looking into it, there's that new concept of the targeted risk analysis. And that's something that there's kind of two versions of it. One is if you're doing a customized approach where you're making your own PCI control, you need to do a targeted risk analysis to, basically make sure that you're covering your risk associated with that new control. And then on the flip side, there's other requirements, 10 or 12, somewhere in that range in the PCI DSS 4.0 that says that you need to perform a certain action periodically. And as far as what the period is, you have to determine that. And so you need to complete a targeted risk analysis to determine if the period you're doing it at is acceptable or not. And I know Andy and I, we've been getting lots of questions from people like, hey, how do we document this? What do we need to do? And so the council has actually sent out some guidance. And so if you haven't checked it out, go out to the PCISSE.org, go to their website. They have guidance now on targeted risk analyses, telling you kind of what's expected. And they also even give a template for a form to complete to kind of fill out to document that. And on that, I know too, it's something that I'm sure Andy can speak to a little bit, that internally here at LBMC, we've been talking through like, hey, when someone's doing one of these targeted risk analyses, who should be documenting that, who should be doing it, as an example, one of the requirements is for if you have POI devices, those point of interaction where you're accepting card information directly from a cardholder with their card, you need to inspect them every so often. And there's a requirement, that says you need to periodically inspect them. So you have to make that determination. But who's really should be doing that is something we've been thinking about. Is that like their, GRC manager or, compliance manager making that arbitrarily? Or should it be more of like a store or retail manager who's making those decisions? And we were, kind of thinking that maybe the council would come out and say one way or the other, but they've kind of left it, completely open and allow people to take whatever approach I guess they want. And even on their template, they don't even lay out like who approved it, or a listing of a role or a responsibility for who did it, just that they have it.
Yeah, I tell you, this is one that I feel very firmly on, and not only beyond compliance, but for best practices. And then although the council hasn't said specifically, I think most merchants and service providers should take it as a best practice to say, all right, who ultimately, just like PCI has defined roles and responsibilities for all the different requirements. They're very specific on, all right, who does the buck stop with? And if companies really want to kind of follow best practices, you would want the folks that ultimately have control of that technology or that requirement, and they're kind of in the situation where they have to fill out this targeted risk analysis. You want them directly involved. You want them to be the one that's signing off on it. To me, being in the industry for quite some time, it just doesn't make sense for you to have someone that's over governance signing off on a targeted risk analysis for how often one of the PTS devices needs to be inspected. You need somebody that's directly involved with that technology and understands the risk.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's going to, ideally be a joint effort, likely having the governance or compliance individual kind of facilitating the process, but then having the responsible individuals who actually know what's going on be the ones that ultimately say, yeah, this is how often we can do it. Because, it's going to come down to their team, their staff that are actually going to be checking those devices in that case. So you would think they want to have a hand in saying how often it takes, has to take place.
Absolutely.
either way, though, it is at least, good, in my opinion, to have that guidance. And so if you do have questions, about that, that's a good place to go. Otherwise, you can always, shoot Andy and me an email, and we'll have, some guidance for you as well, and maybe a few of our own opinions as far as what's the best practice there.
You can find those 2 emails in the description below.
One other thing too, just on the news, is if you want to, depending if you're listening to this when it's kind of dropped right away, coming up on the 13th of December, so not too far in the future, the council is going to be doing a LinkedIn Live talking about resources and whatnot. And so, it's not something they do all the time where they're having public discussions. A lot of times when the council is communicating, it's usually to either participating organizations or just to assessors. And so this is going to be, kind of a public release for information and just how to get resources. I don't know entirely what they're going to cover, but I just wanted to throw that out there, that coming up on the 13th, you'll have a chance to hear directly from them.
That's an awesome opportunity right there, especially to have it live and just that live interaction. I'll tell you, LinkedIn Lives, I've never actually really experienced one until last week. I was looking through and I had some pages that were following and I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. So that's totally an aside from what you were talking about. But anyway, I guess, is that it for the news? I'm assuming so. It looks like that might be all we have to cover today. Yep. Awesome. Well, folks, as we talked about last week and I alluded to a little bit, requirement 8 has been coming down the road for a little while. So hopefully you guys have been preparing to sit back, munch on some popcorn. Hopefully you have your coffee with you today. We're going to be diving into, I guess, the topic of requirement 8 is identifying users and authentication access to system components. So we'll let the real professionals here take it away and talk about it. But man, I'm already ready. I got my coffee in hand. Let's dive into it. Let's do it.
Well, one of the first ones that actually pops up is, it's nothing new. It's what we've kind of heard with every single requirement, and I just alluded to it just a couple of minutes ago, is the defining of the roles and responsibilities. Making sure that, and again, you'll find that the suffix of all these requirements kind of follow a pretty standard, 8.1.2 or 7.1.2 or 6.1.2, whatever that may be. But essentially having those roles and responsibilities defined for who the buck stops with. Who is going to be ultimately responsible for the day-to-day responsibilities and critical activities needs to be defined in policy somewhere. So again, for this one, new requirement, but nothing that should be new. Anybody that's been listening to the podcast for the past couple of months.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing too, just on that, as far as requirement 8, last week or last month, time goes too fast. We were talking about requirement 7. And 7 and 8, like we were saying, then they really go together. 7 is more so on the policies, making sure you're doing role-based access control, things of that nature. And then 8 is more where those hard controls actually come into play. And so the easy way to think about 8 is if you have a way to identify any user who's logging onto or accessing an in-scope system, and you can tie back whatever activity they're doing to that user, more than likely you're going to be compliant with requirement 8 for the most part. That's really the goals, is making sure that you know who's logging on and that you can confirm that's who it is. That's where, even as we'll talk through, it gets into using MFA and passwords and all of that. And really the whole point of that is non-repudiation, making sure that, when I log onto a system and delete the database, I can't say, oh, that was Andy who did that. Making sure that you can say, no, Kyle, that was you. We saw your MFA prompt. It came from your house up in Wisconsin, all of that, making sure you can tie it back to an individual. That's really the goal of 8, just to think about that.
Yeah, a lot of times you'll see, to kind of circle back around with that is typically when we're doing interviews for, requirements 7 and 8, I have found a lot of cases we will have HR representatives on because they'll be assigning job titles to those folks. Hey, what does that look like? Then you'll have, well, this job title is, this is supposed to be a database administrator. They maybe don't understand hey, what a database administrator does, but they know to assign them a specific role that has specific controls. They know who to send the managers to for the approval of that role-based control, and then the rest of the passwords and settings are all going to be done through 8. So yeah, there's definitely a line that gets blurred a lot of the times, but there are definitely definitive actions that have to take place within an entity that kind of define requirements 7 and 8.
Absolutely. To move on a little bit too, to one of the next kind of newish requirements is something that I'm sure everyone has heard 1,000 times, if you went through PCI or just as a best practice in general, is that you should never have generic or shared accounts, which is obviously still the case. But the truth of the matter is, almost every organization does have a generic or shared account somewhere. One of the ones I see a lot, and Andy, I'm guessing this is the same for you, but a lot of people will have kind of their break glass admin accounts, on their networking devices, as a for instance, because you talk to the network admins and they don't trust Active Directory. And what if Active Directory goes down and now we can't get into our firewalls? And so they want to keep that break glass admin account. And historically, that's always been technically non-compliant, and kind of people are skirting the rules with that. But now there's a new requirement, 8.2.2, that says you can't use these group or shared accounts unless you follow kind of an exception basis, which rolls into more or less using a privileged access management solution, some type of a PAM solution where you're like checking out passwords. Again, just having some way to confirm who's doing what.
Yeah, this is a good one. I can't tell you how many times that I have talked to different merchants and say, oh yeah, well our break glass account, it's sitting up in KeyPass, or it's sitting up in whatever are centrally managed. Okay, well, how do you know who checked out what, or who was able to access it? So having something like a privileged access manager where you're checking out passwords is really a great way to make sure you're who ultimately was in this box. And to your point earlier, Kyle, who do we get? Oh, you said you weren't here, but I see your credentials right here. So this is a great way to keep track of who accidentally did something or did something intentionally.
So that
it's jumping. Oh, go ahead, Will.
I was going to say that break glass kind of admin account deal. You mentioned a PAM solution, or kind of like an identity access management solution. I'm guessing there are third parties that provide stuff like that for those accounts. Or could you assign just a bunch of local admins to the network administrators, all with unique passwords? That way you could know who would hop on. Like, would that be a viable option too for someone that isn't going to pay for a PAM or for anything else?
Yeah, it would be. If you gave all of them their own local accounts and they all had unique passwords, that's totally a way that someone could approach that. Just make sure those passwords follow the controls, and they could do that, and there'd be no issue. It's just that most organizations balk at having to manage these extra accounts, which
Right.
Again would be the compliant way to do it. But otherwise, more and more I'm seeing organizations move to something like a CyberArk, and there's other ones out there as well that do the same thing, where they're able to manage those accounts for you. And then what's really nice there is they can even do password rotation. And this is jumping a little bit ahead, but
Absolutely.
we talked last month about service accounts and how they're coming into it. And that's basically, if you have service accounts that allow for users to log into them, if they're interactive service accounts, you also have to manage them basically the same way. You need to have more or less a PAM solution or a PAM process to make sure that I'm not logging in on that service account and pretending to be this service, but I'm actually stealing card data.
Right. Okay, thank you. I appreciate you answering that. So I think you were heading on to. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah, a lot of the rest of the requirement 8 has pretty much stayed standard. Much of the password settings, but there are obviously a couple of changes that kind of have occurred. I feel like your PCI is finally coming up, to the 21st century in regards to password length.
We finally got there, folks.
Coming from 7-character passwords up to 12 is a nice change, and I think a lot of folks were trying to still get by with the bare minimum, but yeah, 12-character passwords, that'll be one that that'll be implemented in. I believe it's, correct me if I'm wrong, if I have. It's 8.3.6. Is that right? Yep. 8.3.6. Yeah, I had to think about that for a second. But that one is not going. That's one of the new ones that's not actually going to go into effect until 2025. So a little bit of time to try to implement that specific requirement. But that's still one that I'm glad to see is finally come down the chain.
The only problem I have with that one is I feel like they moved to 12-character passwords when now it's actually like they should be moving to like 15 or 16-character passwords. Like they're still just kind of a half step behind where they should be, but it's definitely better than 7-character.
Hey, the attackers
Yeah.
have to feed their families somehow, so there's some bribery going on there.
One of the changes that I like, I find funny in 8 is it's one of the few requirements where they actually opened it up more. There used to be a requirement that if a user failed their logging in after 6 times, you'd have to lock their account, and then they'd have to remain locked for 30 minutes or until administratively unlocked. They've now opened that up to 10. So if you have a bunch of employees with fat fingers, they now have an additional 4 times to get in before you have to lock their account.
If it doesn't work on the 9th time, it'll work on the 10th.
Yeah,
I know
don't know.
this is the password. I know this is right.
I know this
I'm
is
typing
it.
it correctly.
And then once you get it on like the 9th time, you're like, I knew it. I knew that was the password. I had it the whole time. It's a really big accomplishing feeling whenever you get that.
That's one of the ones that I don't think it's concerning either way, but I just wonder where the discussions went, who in the council's like, I hate having to always get my password wrong, so I need a few more tries and I'll get it.
Someone got burned bad, so we have to change
exactly.
this. Oh my gosh, that's awesome. All right.
One similar to that a lot of people potentially would love, depending on how they have their organization set up, is now there's an option to actually no longer have the 90-day password rotation. That's something that PCI has always had, forced you to rotate your passwords, every 90 days, at least every 90 days, and expire and make a new password. And NIST and other password authorities have come out and claimed that password rotation is a bad practice because it makes everyone just do spring 2023, fall 2023, because they constantly have to change them, so they don't set anything hard. And so now there's a change where if you either are using MFA always, so if a password is always used in conjunction with another authentication factor, you no longer have to rotate that password. Or if you're doing continual behavioral analysis of that account, you can also stop rotating that password. So if you're using, some tool like an Okta, or there's other ones out there that are basically checking out that user in that account, saying like, hey, you're logging in during normal hours, you're doing expected behaviors, you're logging in from Boston where you expect, you're not logging in from Singapore or something like that. If you have a system that's adequately doing that, that can also mean you no longer have to rotate those passwords.
Yeah. And not to add insult to injury for poor Okta, and although I have seen them utilized in multiple different places, they're kind of under a little bit of scrutiny right now with what was something like 18 or 20,000 customers breaches, and they had to come out with an addendum that said that hey, not only that, well, your name and email addresses for all the customer support users were also breached, and you're like, oh god. So you might want to wait just a second before you go ahead and implement that. But, just a kind of side note there.
They've been in a little bit of hot water the past few years. They've had some incidents happening over there.
It's always scary. I still think it's worthwhile to use solutions like them. Andy's point, I'm not sure I'd recommend them, but it's always scary when you kind of take an organization like that and literally give them the keys to the kingdom. Like they can do everything, they have it all, and they're protecting it all from you. So you have to have a very high level of trust. But at the same time, a lot of times it can make you more secure as long as they hold up their end of the bargain.
So that's why you got to vet. You got to vet your vendors. Vet your vendors, folks.
And one of the new, again, speaking about kind of the signing on with multi-factor authentication, there's been some additional guidance, and this is specifically around 8.4.2 about. A lot of times what we would see in different merchants is in order to meet the multi-factor authentication in their CDE, they were like, hey, look, well, we're using MFA to sign in with the VPN. That's enough, right? Where there's the multi-factor authentication. Now we should be able to access it. So PCI actually has gone a step further in regards to saying, hey, what do we really talk? How many times do we really have to do this? So there has to be this initial connection, as far as remote access, and there's the multi-factor authentication. Okay, that's fine. but that person would also have to do it twice when they're actually connecting to the individual CDE via some sort of kind of non-console access. So it definitely does have to be done 2 times. Not the initial remote access into the environment is not enough. There needs to be a second multi-factor authentication login in order to get into the CDE, and now PCI has come out and made that very clear.
Yeah. And, if you can still use the same solution. So if you're using, Duo, you can use Duo for both those authentication steps, because I know that's something that's confused people where they think they need to have 2 MFA solutions, and that's not the case. It's just that, if you VPN in, you need to get that Duo hit. And then when you log into your CDE or cardholder data environment, you need to get that MFA hit again. And like Andy was saying, when you log into the CDE, that could either be if you're logging into an individual server, at that point you can get that MFA hit, or just when you're logging into the entire environment, if you have like a jump box, you can hit that jump box MFA there, and then you're free to work inside of it, and you don't need to have MFAs for each individual one. It's just that the VPN or remote access and the CDE access both need to have separate MFA authentications.
Now, is there a requirement for whenever you're hopping into the CDE? Does it have to be pushed? Does it have to be like numerical values that you enter in? Like, is there any requirement for the kind of MFA that it is, or is it just MFA in general?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, not at this time. PCI doesn't call out specifically what it has to be. Whether it's a push notification or some sort of numerical value, like a text. But
Right.
it makes sense. Again, on the best practice that there would be some more specific change to that, as I don't know, maybe it'll make it happen in the next 5 to 10 years. But yeah, so yeah, there's a possibility. Now PCI does call out a couple of specifications in regards to this, much like what we see when we're auditing individual retail stores and we're talking about the individual cashiers that have access to 1 credit card at a time. We're not saying that the point of sale cashiers have to use multi-factor authentication, in order to get into the, this point of sale systems. Nor does this apply to individual like system application accounts, where MFA has to be done. So the PCI did call out a couple of things. I think these were questions that came out when they were initially developing 4.0, and they kind of defined this more specifically. Hey, yeah, this doesn't apply with A, B, and C, and all that kind of good stuff. So they did elaborate a little bit more on what is not required, but yeah, there's definitely some additional details I feel like they could provide for this one.
One thing too, just to think about it, that is a switch with 4.0, is that previously MFA for access into the CDE was only required for administrative access. So if you had users that were accessing it, they didn't necessarily need to have MFA. And now the requirement just says MFA is needed for all access into the CDE. So, more than likely, most people getting into the CDE are going to be admins, depending on how you have it set up, because ideally you have your users just accessing, the relevant places more through applications and kind of front ends, and not getting them all the way into accessing servers. But if they are needing to do that for any reason, they need MFA as well.
Yeah, that did actually bring up a couple of questions for me that I'm still kind of thinking through. So and again, we can kind of bounce this around quickly. Is that I get the question a lot of times when you have internal vulnerability scans, and you're using one single management console, and then you have individual agents that are running on on systems themselves to perform those scans. Well, the normal practice is not to log on to these kind of individual agents that are running the scans in different areas. It's usually everything's done through the management portal, but it's possible. You can log on to those individual agents. You can go in and that do have inbound connections into the CDE in order to, and those are usually done using the system level accounts, the application accounts. So this one kind of brought up an interesting question before, because PCI does say this does not apply to application system accounts, which something like a Nessus scanner would be. However, if you're using it if there's a possibility you can use it as an interactive account, then would multi-factor authentication apply there? So I know there's a little bit of a gray area there, to where it's not normal practice to use a application system account in order to log into something like an agent or a node that is there in order to manage that. Everything's done from the management console, but it still is direct access. So there's almost like a conflict there. I feel like, because it is an application system account, but it does have inbound connections into the CDE. So is multi-factor authentication required?
I think, some of that gets into actually then, some of the new requirement 8 items around service accounts and, managing them. And it kind of ties in. I was going to say that, yeah. Yeah, because there's 2 big parts of it. One is that for all your service accounts now, historically, PCI, for whatever reason, has never really cared about service accounts, which, still seems weird to me, but now they finally are. And on one side, now you have to have a process where you're reviewing them, making sure they have, legitimate access. And, it's not just, they actually have least privileged access where they're not just admins everywhere. They only have access where they need to have it. And they have a process to rotate their passwords. And then if you have ones, again, that have that interactive capability, then you have to have additional ways that you're managing them where, your passwords are, not known to people. You can't just sign in. If you do, there's a, exception process followed for that. So to some degree, I agree with you, Andy, but I think that a little bit, some of that 8.6, some of those items can help with that a little bit.
Yeah, and the only reason this actually came up, this was a question I had with a client, and so I agree with you. That was the kind of the guidance I gave them as well, kind of the offering the layered security effect of management of the system accounts, and what that have the interactive ability. That's the key word in there. If these are interactive system accounts or interactive support accounts, whatever that may be, then yes, there has to be a process of inventory, access control, review of those roles. But then, that question came up was like, hey, well, okay, well, I see this as far as multi-factor. I see the review process, and that's fine. But the multi-factor authentication, I feel like there's a conflict here. And I was like, wow. Yes, I see how you could make that argument. So does this system account that says, that PCI says is, and hopefully PCI will offer some additional guidance about that, but that was kind of a question that had come up from a client. And I was like, that's a good call out, and PCI has yet to, say definitively on that. I feel like there is some conflict, but again, there should be enough of a layered approach given the audit of those system level accounts that would hopefully prevent any kind of exploitation of that particular piece.
Yeah. And I would say too, with all of that, as far as system accounts go and the new requirements, the first thing everyone should do within their in-scope environment is go identify all of those, first figure out your system accounts, but then in that step 1 should be which ones allow for interactive login and which ones don't. And then for all of those ones that allow for interactive login, determine if they really need that or if it's just the way that they were set up. Because all too often people don't really realize it and they just set up those interactive accounts and they don't really need that capability. And if you can get 100%. Rid of all those interactives, that's going to make your life so much easier.
100% on that. Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, there's a section right after that kind of deals kind of based off of the inventory application system accounts. And I'll be honest, I have not seen this. I have not seen this, at least in quite some time. It has been at least years where anyone is using any of those kind of system application accounts that are hard coded into scripts and so forth and so on. And again, Will, you might be able to speak to this too as a pen tester. I haven't seen that in a long time. I think that most people have moved away from that practice of hard coding, application and system accounts into scripts that they run for whatever that may be. But Will, I mean, you may be able to actually speak to that if you have seen it.
Let's say I'm smiling over here because it was last week that I saw it on a PowerShell script. Somebody added on their PowerShell script on their SMB share. So it is still used by very few, but it's still out there.
And I tell you what, it's been a long time since I did pen testing. It's been at least 4.5 years since I was last a pen tester. So I had not seen it in a while. And even on the PCI audit side of it, we don't interact, with a lot of scripts, for the most part, but That's interesting you say that, because I'll definitely make sure I keep that one at the front of my head
I
there.
was gonna say. I mean, look, hey, whenever you get keys to the kingdom and you see an IT folder in the share, you're like, I'm going straight there first because there are scripts that manage things. And
That's
Absolutely.
definitely
yeah,
like that requirement, and other ones are where I feel like, us QSAs really have to rely on pen testers to a degree,
Oh yeah,
because a client can say, hey, we never hard code our scripts, and we can
right.
review some scripts, but at the end of the day, we're never going to review or see every single script that they have. And even the people we talk to aren't going to be aware of every single script. And even if
Right.
they have controls to try to stop it, it can still happen. And that's
Yeah.
where, an assessment is good, but a pen test is also needed to verify some of those things.
I was about to say, I don't
100%.
know what all kind of solutions exist out there, but I spend a ton of time creating my own script that just searches
Yeah.
for passwords and keys and files, and I will run it on all SMB shares that I have access to. So if it's sitting in some random obscure file that you think that nobody will find, I guarantee you
Right.
we're going to find it. So just letting you know, don't hard code that stuff in there. There's a reason why it's put
Yeah.
into this.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of like, caveating into, well, not caveating, excuse me, moving into the next little section again. Again, there's a lot of this ins and outs, and it's really important that folks really get a hold of these system and application accounts, because it really was a big part of the changes that PCI made for 4.0. But this goes hand in hand with another requirement, which is the targeted risk analysis. So how often are we having to change these passwords? And Kyle kind of alluded to the additional guidance that PCI put out this week it was last week, in regards to the how often that needs to be done. So a targeted risk analysis of those accounts needs to be performed. And so there's obviously now PCI has pushed out templates to kind of, help with that and assist with that. And best practices, having somebody that is a part of the review process, in my thought, that should be involved in how often those accounts need to be changed, so they can help with the targeted risk analysis. Get off my soapbox.
We're here for it, Eddie. We're here for it. You're enlightening us. So I guess here's one more question that I have here before we kind of wrap things up, because I think that was 8.6.3, correct?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay,
correct.
cool. So one last question here before we wrap things up for this episode. Do all in scope accounts need to follow all of these requirements that we've kind of talked about today?
No, that at the end of the day, they don't. And, that's kind of like Andy was saying earlier. For instance, if you have store employees that are logging into cash registers, to, take payments and whatnot, they're not going to have MFA. And historically, like in version 3.2.1, if you looked at the data security standard, up at the top of requirement 8, there was kind of a call out, a note that said, hey, these specific requirements aren't applicable to people that only basically interact with one card number at a time. So if you have, an individual working in a store, or maybe even a call center agent, that they're just receiving one card number at a time, entering it into a system, they don't have a capability to pull up reports with thousands of card numbers or anything. That's, pretty minimal risk. So some of the controls didn't apply to them, and that's held over to 4.0. But instead of having that note up at the top of the requirement, now in each of the sub requirements in requirement 8, there's always that little applicability section. And if you look in there, it will say, like, this isn't applicable to individuals that only interact with one card number at a time. So through each of those and see, it'll help you determine which ones of those controls, because some of these requirements are, really administrative focused, or, database focused, or, for people who have the ability to, get those keys to the kingdom. But if you're just, working at a retail store and you're swiping cards all day, you don't need to follow so many controls, because you don't have that much ability to impact the security of the, the cardholder information.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's kind of opposite of what I thought. I would have guessed, yes, they do need to follow these requirements. But once you start to break it down and you really showcase, oh, there are all these other exceptions, that makes sense. Makes sense to me why they would answer like that.
And the key thing there is, Will, the key thing that a lot of people miss is this piece right here. Who has access to bulk cardholder data?
Yep.
Bulk. Individual credit cards and stuff, that the risk is very low. But what technologies, what people, What processes have access to bulk credit cards? That is the spirit of PCI.
Okay. That makes a lot
Yeah.
of sense. Who can do the most damage?
We want to protect everyone, but if someone steals, we all know that basically on a weekly basis, I feel like you're getting your card number breached somewhere, and it's just onesie twosies and not that big of a deal. And those don't really ever hit the news. But when you hear about someone losing 50,000 plus card numbers, those are the things that are really
those
concerns.
are the big things. Yeah, those are really, because there were big security gaps that were left open there.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Guys, thank you for hanging in with this 36 minute long podcast. I told you, I hope you finished your coffee and your popcorn. Those two don't really go hand in hand, but that was the first thing that came to mind whenever I said it. So, gentlemen, any parting words before we wrap it up for good?
Not for me.
I guess not too much. Enjoy the holiday season here, and Merry Christmas.
Perfect.
Yep. We'll be back at the new year with our new podcast then.
The new year's coming in fast. Thank you guys so much for listening. We hope that you had a fantastic Thanksgiving and that you enjoy your holidays coming up. Enjoy the PTO. Take time off. Be with family. Do whatever you got to do. So We'll see you guys again in the new year. Take care.
All right. See you guys.